Welcome everyone to the Michigan Department of Education's Comprehensive History Instruction webinar series. My name is Dr. Michael Rice. I'm the state superintendent. It is an honor and a privilege to be here with you today. Today, we're fortunate to have an exceptional presenter to discuss the Civil War amendments up to the Civil Rights Movement. This session offers educators greater depth of knowledge about how the amendments to the U.S. Constitution following the Civil War were pivotal to the progress of our nation. This is the fourth topic in a series that the department is offering associated with a comprehensive teaching of U.S. and world history. As educators, we have the responsibility to teach the full breadth of history, including about difficult and challenging subjects such as race, racism, sexism, xenophobia, and colonialism. As searing as some of our history is, we have a responsibility to teach it all to our children. This broad effort will help you as educators learn more about historical movements, events, and peoples that are part of the complex, diverse history of our country and world, and by extension, help you explore the same comprehensive history with your students. We are grateful for our presenter today, Dr. Pamela Brandwein, a professor at the University of Michigan's Department of Political Science. She is a specialist in the law and politics of the American Reconstruction period, and her research and teaching focus on American constitutional development, race, politics, and civil rights, and American political development. This webinar series will focus on the U.S. South as a slave society, the Reconstruction Era, and the Jim Crow era. Information includes the formation of political parties, legislative acts, compromises, economic policies, and court decisions that influenced these eras. I'd like to thank Dr. Brandwein for sharing her expertise and assistance in the growth of knowledge and understanding among our educators. I'd also like to thank the supporting education organizations whose partnership in an era of attempts to narrow curriculum and encourage subject and book banning is inspiring in and of itself. I'd like to thank the Teaching Comprehensive History webinar series team for its continued efforts in organizing spaces for us to meet and learn. And finally, I'd like to thank you, our attendees, for joining us on this teaching and learning journey. Thank you for your courage, your interest, and your conviction. And now I turn it over to Scott Koenig, our special consultant for social studies. Scott, to you.
Thank you, Dr. Rice. Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us. My name is Scott Koenig, and I am a social studies consultant with the Michigan Department of Education. We're thrilled to have all of you in attendance as we continue the Comprehensive History webinar series in 2023. Before I introduce today's presenter, I want to share a few housekeeping announcements. Participants' video, audio, and chat features have been turned off. Questions for our presenter may be added using the Q&A feature, and questions will be addressed toward the end of this event if time permits. If we run out of time, we will follow up Q&A with an email or through email. We will provide a link to access a resource folder. This folder contains our presenter's outline and supporting resources for you to explore throughout today's presentation. Also, if you would like a sketch, please be sure to sign in on the sketches link that will be provided in the chat in today's presentation. You can adjust your speaker view options anytime by selecting the View button at the top right of the Zoom window. Towards the end of today's presentation, a linked survey will be presented to you at the close of this webinar. Please provide us with your feedback. Closed captioning and American Sign Language interpreter have been provided. If closed captioning isn't automatically visible, select the Show Subtitle option. Your interpreter for today is Candace Barrier. Presenting today is Dr. Pamela Brandwein. Dr. Brandwein is a professor of political science at the University of Michigan. She is a specialist in the law and politics of Reconstruction, and her research and teaching focus on American constitutional development, race, politics, and civil rights, and American political development. She is the author of two books, Reconstructing Reconstruction, The Supreme Court and the Production of Historical Truth with Duke University Press in 1999, and Rethinking the Judicial Settlement of Reconstruction with Cambridge University Press in 2011. the latter of which offers a fresh examination of major Supreme Court decisions following the Civil War. She teaches courses on the politics of civil liberties and civil rights, race, and American political development, and law and institutions, and her courses offer students an approach to the study of American politics that is attentive to the political systems, the construction of meaning, and change over time. Drawing students from across the university, her courses provide an array of tools for thinking systematically about the history and politics of race and inequality. She has won numerous awards for her teaching and is the two-time winner of the Tronstein Award for outstanding teaching in the Department of Political Science. She has also lectured in a wide variety of university, professional, and community settings, ranging from federal judicial conferences to the Interfaith Roundtable of Washtenaw County. She has twice been honored to deliver Leon Silverman lectures sponsored by the Supreme Court Historical Society, having the privilege of being introduced by Justice Ginsburg in 2015 and Justice Sotomayor in 2019. Dr. Brandwein, thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you, Scott. It is really a delight to be here with you all. And I'm going to jump right into this. I'm focusing today on the slavery conflict as it leads up to the Civil War. And then later presentations in the following couple of weeks will be on Reconstruction and the Jim Crow era. So just as a tiny overview, I'm going to start by contextualizing American slavery in an Atlantic world context. And that context develops from the 16th to the 19th century. And this is the era of modern slavery. Then I'm going to turn to what's specific about American slavery. And there are some features that are unique to American slavery that are worth flagging, and some key characteristics about slavery at the founding that I'll identify. And then I'll turn to the conflict over slavery and how that conflict unfolds. And one of the central points of today's presentation, and I'm going to come back to this, is that folks tend to think of the slavery conflict as one conflict, North versus South. And that's a function of the Civil War. But there were multiple conflicts pertaining to slavery. And these multiple conflicts unfold over time. And they're actually going to continue on into Reconstruction. And so there'll be continuities between this presentation and the next one. And so to start with the US South, the US South was a slave society. And what I mean by that is that all major institutions, political, social, economic, were organized by slavery. And there's a difference between a slave society and a society with slavery. And in terms of slave societies, there actually haven't been that many of them. We have ancient Greece and ancient Rome, so two in the ancient era. And then in the modern era, that 16th to the 19th centuries, we've got the American South, Brazil, and then the Caribbean, which is considered generally as a whole, although you have Britain, you have France, and you have different slave colonies in the Caribbean. And this was Atlantic world slavery. And a couple of differences between ancient slavery and modern slavery. The Romans and the Greeks conquered, and the people they conquered, they took as slaves. So there's slavery by conquest. In modern slavery is racial. It's racialized, it's restricted. At first, indigenous populations in the Americas, and then restricted to African slavery. And so that's quite distinctive. And in terms of just a couple of numbers, there were about 12.5 million people who were put through the Middle Passage, who went through the Middle Passage. About 10.7 million of those individuals survived. And only about 3.6% of that number, about 388,000, were sent to the US colonies. Folks tend to be surprised by that number as being as low as it is. One of the resources I've provided is the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, and that has just a wealth of information about the Middle Passage. Now, in terms of New World slavery, modern slavery, the big thing to flag right off the bat is sugar. Sugar was the first major slave good, the first slave product. And it was initially a luxury item. And the slave goods, the slave products that came out of the Atlantic world, sugar, tobacco, coffee, cocoa, these items became in Europe the basis for a growing market. It's really the beginnings of consumerism in Europe. And the British, their colonies in Barbados and Jamaica were the big sugar colonies. And sugar slavery had a very, very high mortality rate, had the highest mortality rate of any kind of slave crop. Boiling cane was extremely, extremely dangerous. And one of the things to note in terms of the Caribbean is that the switch to sugar happened around 1650. And 1650 is the big jump that you see in the importation of people through the Middle Passage. And so 95% of enslaved Africans went through the Middle Passage after 1650. It's after the switch to sugar. And so all of that's happening before cotton. Cotton actually comes rather late in the development of these markets. And so when you think about the development of the European consumer capitalism, slave products were at the beginning of that. And economic historians have identified slavery as integral to the rise of the Atlantic economy. Now, this is not industrialization. Industrialization comes later. We're just talking about the formation of consumer markets. Slavery was integral to that. The other aspect of the Atlantic world system to flag is its political culture. And we see this with the French Revolution, we see this with the American Revolution, a commitment on some level to individual rights, to a premise of equality. And this is going to matter in the US in complicated ways. And so turning to the US South, turning to distinctive, unique elements of the US South, even as it's embedded in this wider New World slavery, a number of unique elements. The first one is that there was a resident slave owner class. This was different. In the other slave colonies, the slave owners lived at home. They were basically absentee. And when I ask students, it's like, well, what difference do you think it makes that the slave owners lived there? They're very good at thinking about, well, what difference might this make? And they come up with everything from the vulnerability to sexual assault on the part of enslaved women to the teaching that these planters taught their children to enact ritualized violence. The transmission of culture through the family is something that happened on American slave plantations because of a resident slave owner class. Another thing, you had in the United States, in the American South, the sharpest black-white dualism in any of these New World slave societies, sharpest distinction between black and white. You had a one-drop rule in the United States. And scholars have thought about, well, why might this have happened? And the reason that they've come up with is the Declaration of Independence, that political culture that valued individual rights, that had the premise of equality. If you have a society where the Declaration is there and you have chattel slavery, that contradiction is very salient. If you have a society without the Declaration, without any tradition of individual rights, slavery becomes less contradictory to everything else around it. And so that black-white dualism, which is going to really play out in the United States, is in part a function actually of the Declaration of Independence. Now, the last thing I want to flag in terms of the unique qualities of American slavery is that the slaveholders had more political power in the American South than slaveholders did in any of these other slave colonies. And that political power is hugely consequential. And it's a function of the United States Constitution. The Constitution was a cross-cutting document. It made concessions to the South. And there were a number of them that are no doubt familiar. Congress couldn't ban the importation of slaves until 1808. There was a fugitive slave clause that became very consequential. But the big thing I want to flag is the 3/5 clause. And the 3/5 clause pertained to representation in Congress. It increased the political power at the national level of slave states. As a function of the 3/5 clause, Southern states had about 1/3 more seats in the House of Representatives than their free population warranted. And that translates into electoral college strength. So the South is getting about 20 more seats because their slaves, who obviously have no political voice, are counting for them in terms of representation. Between George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, we have 72 years. 50 of those 72 years, the US had a slaveholding president. The 4 of the 6 Northern presidents catered to slavery interests. And so, you know, the free state, folks who were anti-slavery wanted slaves not to count at all for purposes of representation. And pro-slave interests wanted slaves to count fully for purposes of representation. That 3/5 number was that compromise, but it was enormously consequential in shaping legislation and shaping the political power of slaveholders. Okay, so some key characteristics about the founding era. There was a general consensus that slavery violated what was called natural law. But the consensus was that it could be established by written law. And this was called positive law, not positive in the sense of good, but positive in the sense that it's written down. Now you can look at this from 2 directions. If there's a strong commitment to natural law, this obviously looks like a contradiction. The other thing to keep in mind is that the movement against slavery hasn't happened yet. There's a scholar, his name is David Bryan, Brion Davis. He devoted his career to examining the rise of abolition sentiment, anti-slavery sentiment in the 1770s and 1780s. And it takes that long. Slavery, it's thousands and thousands of years old, but it's only in the 1780s that you start to see the rise of an abolition movement, first in Britain. And so we shouldn't be surprised that folks in 1787 thought slavery could be established by written law. That had been the practice for a long time. If anything, we should be surprised that natural law has come on the scene as saying slavery is in violation of natural law. But the upshot, when we're thinking about the founding, is that, well, we have Southern slave codes. And there was the consensus that Southern slavery was constitutional. And it was constitutional because they had written into their constitutions laws protecting property rights and human beings. And this was the view in the North and the South. But there's also in the Constitution something called the Territories Clause. This is Article 4, Section 3. The Constitution says that in Article 4, Section 3, that Congress shall have the power to make all rules and regulations respecting the territory of the United States. And when this country was formed in 1787, everybody expected it to expand. And so that Territories Clause is going to become absolutely crucial because the slavery conflict, as it unfolds, is going to be over the extension of slavery. It's going to be over control of those Western territories that get added to the United States. And I'll talk about that as things go on. So those 2 things, Southern slavery is constitutional, general consensus, but that Territories Clause is going to be absolutely critical. Now, one more thing about the founding. It said in the 1780s, the US South was still doing mostly tobacco slavery. There's tobacco, there's rice, there's indigo. It's not yet cotton. There's a transition to cotton that occurs from about 1790 to about 1820. And folks have probably heard about Eli Whitney and the cotton gin in 1780, 1793, and they think cotton starts with the founding. And that's really a mistake. We don't have cotton yet, and this is going to matter. The transition to cotton occurs because Britain is going through an industrial revolution, and Britain is going to become the main buyer of American cotton, but that's just starting to creep up, and you really don't see American cotton production start to spike, get higher until about 1820, 1825, and then in 1830 it starts to really shoot up. Big leap in the 1830s. And what happens in the 1830s is that you have new technology. You have something called the saw gin, not Eli Whitney's cotton gin, but the saw gin, much more efficient at processing cotton. You have new Gulf seed, new cotton seed that's been developed that is much more productive. And like I said, you have the British buying up all this cotton. And so by the 1830s, cotton is generating enormous wealth, and the production of it is going through the roof. And during the founding, you have this view, even expressed by slaveholders, that slavery was a necessary evil. That's the way they talked about it. But that transition from tobacco to cotton coincides, not accidentally, with a shift in talking about slavery. The pro-slavery folk shifted from talking about slavery as a necessary evil to talking about it as a positive good. And Senator John Calhoun gives a speech in the Senate. It's an 1837 speech. It's in the materials. And this is a very famous speech where he articulates this idea that slavery is a positive good. But the date here matters. It's 1837. And it's in that context that I've just identified. Now, in terms of pro-slavery theory, I just want to flag two different ways that the pro-slavery folk defended slavery. And this is going to matter, as the talk today unfolds and later talks. The first way that pro-slavery theorists justified slavery was by using what's called Herrenvolk theory, Herrenvolk, Herrenvolk, master race. The idea here that they articulated was that, first of all, only Blacks were fit for slavery, that Blacks were subhuman. They used biblical defenses of this, and they talked about slaves as providing what was called a mudsill for white men's democracy. A mudsill, like a foundation, a base. And the idea was that, well, there's a lot of drudge work that has to get done, and you're going to have slaves do it. And that made a democracy of white men possible. And the key element to this Herrenvolk theory was the equality of white men. And this is a Jacksonian idea, this equality idea, but it only pertained to white men. And so the equality of white men, this is the democracy that's made possible by slavery. And the idea that these Herrenvolks articulated was that slavery was proper, it was necessary, it was good. And again, I can't underscore this enough, it made democracy for white men possible. Senator Henry Hammond articulates this mudsill theory in a document you also have. The date on that is 1858. It's a much later expression, but as a source for this mudsill theory, it's Hammond. Now, the alternative theory of slavery was articulated by the folks who were called paternalists, and George Fitzhugh was one of the main exemplars of this. And Fitzhugh basically said that society is hierarchically organized, just organically. And he said, yes, Black people were appropriately slaves, but Fitzhugh also said that Italians and the Irish who did not own property were also fit for slavery. And he talked about moral stewardship, that slavery would uplift all of these groups, and to be a slave was to be better than to be a wage laborer up north. But the key thing about Fitzhugh is that the Irish and the Italians without property were fit for slavery. Now in the South, and this varied by state and it varied by region, about 1/3 of the white population had no land and no slaves. About half of the white population did have some chunk of land, but no slaves. Only about 1/5 of the white population had land and at least one enslaved person. And then an even tinier percentage were the big planters. And so if you think about it, you've got a very large percentage of white people in the South who do not own slaves at all. And think about the attraction of that Herrenvolk theory to them. They get included in white men's democracy as a pro-slavery theory. And so have that in the back of your mind, and this is gonna matter when we get to Reconstruction. Is there's going to be development in this pro-slavery theory. That the paternalist theory falls out. I mean, the white folks without property do not like the George Fitzhugh theory of slavery for obvious reasons. Okay, one note on Southern versus Northern wealth. And I've given you some maps and some figures from Gavin Wright. And Gavin Wright is a very prominent historian of American slavery. He's an American economic historian. But you don't have, obviously no need to look at these maps right now, but just a couple of things I want to flag. He's got a chart in there about regional wealth differences between 1850 and 1860. And what's significant about this is that the North has more wealth at both points, but the South is closing the gap between 1850 and 1860. And this is a function of cotton. Here's the other thing. Over half of Southern wealth is a function of the value of the people they're holding as slaves. And so Southern wealth is in literally slave bodies and the cotton that they're selling. And Northern wealth is in the value of their commercial farms. If you look at the value of farms, the value of farms is much, much, much higher in the North than it is in the South. And what you see in these maps is that the percentage of slaves in the population tracks the value of personal property. And so you have a very clear representation of these maps. And these are maps of the United States by county. We're all familiar with these state maps by county from watching election returns. Whenever there's an election, states by county. These are county level maps. And you get a very clear picture that Southern wealth resides embodied in the bodies of people held in slavery, and Northern wealth is in commercial farming, is in actually their land. The other thing that to flag about these maps is that the North has many, many more people. The population density in the North is overwhelming compared to the South. And this matters for slavery politics. And I want to turn to that now. So teaching about anti-slavery politics is complicated because you want to kind of work, when I do this, I always want to work on sort of two dimensions simultaneously. I want to work by sequence. I want to work by, here's what happens in 1820, here's what happens in 1848, here's what happens in 1854. But it's the story that teaches people. It's the conflict that teaches people. And so at each time, here's the conflict, and here's how the conflict evolves. And so that's how I want to do it right now. So the conflict. The South and what's called the anti-slavery faction, the Free Soil faction, they both want the West. They both want the Western territories. And the pro-slavery South, it's actually easier to describe their position. They want the West for sort of two main reasons. The first one is that they're worried about exhausting their soil. They don't have as much sort of agricultural know-how yet as much in the North in terms of maintaining the fertility of the soil, so they exhaust soil more quickly. And so they need new land. But the big reason is that they need new states to hold on to the Senate. They know that all that population is in the north. And where there's more northern population, you're going to get free states as those folks go west. The way the South is going to maintain its political power is by holding on to the Senate. And to hold on to the Senate, you need new slave states to counter every new free state. And the Senate becomes their veto point. And they know this, and they are going to hold on. They need new states. And they're going to secede ultimately when it becomes completely clear to them that they've lost control over the Western territories. But now I'm getting ahead of myself. So the anti-slavery coalition, and I'm going to call this the Free Soil Coalition, I'll refer to it as the anti-slavery movement. There are internal divisions within the anti-slavery movement that are absolutely crucial to delineate, to understand this conflict. These conflicts are going to become very important during Reconstruction because they're going to be fights over what it means to destroy slavery. Well, the origin of those fights is in the antebellum era, where there are very different critiques of the problem with slavery, of what's wrong with slavery. There are going to be a lot of people who are going to say, we can't let slavery expand, but they're going to give very, very different reasons about why. And so let me flesh this out. So the Free Soil faction, think about free soil as a policy, no slave law in the territories. Free labor ideology gave the explanation about why you support free soil. What are the reasons for keeping slavery out of the territories? And free labor ideology was fundamentally ambiguous when it came to race and when it came to, well, what's your vision of the nation that you are pursuing? Because it's this vision of nationhood that's racialized quite explicitly on the part of some in the anti-slavery movement. And for others, they left it ambiguous. So let me talk about this. Okay, this is about free labor ideology and why it's ambiguous and how it worked politically for Lincoln and for other Republicans. The basic idea is that labor is dignified. The dignity of labor, this is a major sort of important phrase, that folks have the right to the fruits of their labor. And labor included manual laborers, it included farmers, artisans, it included small-scale capitalists. Some people also included merchants in this category. It's a very broad category, and this is important to understanding how it worked so well politically, because it was a very middle-classy construct, but that also included manual laborers. So the idea is that labor is dignified, but that slavery degraded labor. Slavery degraded labor. Well, okay, how? The idea was that, well, slavery provided no motivation for the worker, right? You're not working for yourself. So it sapped motivation. But there's also this idea that slavery hurt economic development. It hurt progress. It hurt nationhood. And it made the South backward economically. There were lots of visitors who went south who came back saying, boy, there's a lot of backward economic sort of visuals down there. And for folks who supported free labor ideology, they had this idea of the United States as a millennial republic, a republic that could escape the poverty that was afflicting Europe. There's this idea that industrialization automatically brings poverty, and that the United States, because it had land, that land served as a safety valve, and that folks could move west to escape poverty, and the United States could ever renew itself, and that it could escape the afflictions of Europe. And so this was nationhood, was staked to having no slavery in those Western territories. But there's a root ambiguity in this idea that slavery degrades labor. Because was it the institution of slavery? Was it slave law that was the problem? And if that's the problem, you get rid of the law, everything's fine. Or Was it the presence of Black people given dominant racialized meanings that circulated and were dominant at the time? This is about the ideological meaning of Blackness. And oftentimes, free soilers, stop the extension of slavery, made no distinction between slave labor and free Black labor. And so this was an indication that for them, it was all about the Blackness. Their racial ideology was dominant here in terms of their understanding of the territories as for a white nation. Now, there were other elements in the free soil movement. The centrist Republicans, folks like Lincoln, and they're going to either be ambiguous, they're not going to specify what's wrong, they're just going to leave it ambiguous, and this worked politically for them. It let them get a very big umbrella, bringing people into the umbrella to get support for this movement. So their ambiguity served a political purpose. So, okay, sequence. We start with the Missouri Compromise. I remember learning about the Missouri Compromise in 1820 without any story about why it mattered. And so again, teaching about this stuff is, for me, it's always been, what is the conflict? Students remember conflicts. The dates can get fuzzy to give them a reason about why these dates matter. The conflict is key. And so for the Missouri Compromise, no slavery north of that 3630 parallel that cut across the country. The state of Missouri comes in as a slave state, but everything above that has to be a free state. Everything below that has to be a slave state. Now in 1820, you still to the west have Mexico. Texas is not a part of the US at this point. So that line actually doesn't extend very far. The US isn't that big yet. This is kind of the Louisiana Purchase territory. But it looks sectional. The Missouri Compromise looks like a sectional conflict. And it's going to get complicated real fast. So hold on. Now, 1831, again, I'm going to try to stick to the chronology, but keep the multiple conflicts going. In 1831, we have two important events. William Lloyd Garrison is an evangelical abolitionist, and very small faction. This is a group that argued for the immediate emancipation of slaves in the South. Garrison argued that slaveholding was a moral sin, and he published a newspaper called The Liberator. And most treatments of American slavery will reduce all of anti-slavery to Garrison. And that's just a profound mistake. In fact, Garrison and his evangelicals were hated in the North. In the North, they called them disunionists. They were very, very disliked. Never got traction because of that consensus that Southern slavery is constitutional. This didn't help people who were enslaved, of course. But the conflict that leads to the Civil War is not about Southern slavery per se. It's about the extension of that social and economic system and a vision of the United States that grew from Southern slavery. So Southern slavery is implicated, but in that sense. The other thing that happens in 1831 is Nat Turner's rebellion. You had slave insurrections. You had a bunch of slave insurrections. You had the Haitian Revolution in 1791. And this constantly gave the lie to slave owners' arguments that slavery was a benevolent institution. And so those slave insurrections really mattered in terms of keeping it on the table in terms of resistance to slavery and a very direct counter to one of the core elements of pro-slavery ideology. Now, the last thing I'll just mention about the 1830s, you have the publication of William Yates's The Rights of Colored Men. This is one of the first legal treatises that laid out a case for equal Black citizenship. The idea doesn't get traction. It doesn't get traction until after the Civil War. But it's important to note that it's circulating now. It's there in the world now in the late 1830s. And equal citizenship rights, equal property, equal contract, equal suing, equal testifying. We would regard those rights as very narrow in scope, but at the time, it was a claim for equal citizenship that would have made a tremendous difference for free Black people traveling anywhere, because they were denied rights of mobility, they were denied access to free states, and I will come back to that point. Okay, so next big date, 1848. This is associated with the Mexican War. This is when US and Mexico have a war in 1846. Mexico cedes all of this land to the United States as part of the treaty. The land mass of the United States doubles with this cession of land. Present day, California, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, much of Arizona, much of Colorado, parts of Oklahoma, Kansas, Wyoming, all of this territory comes in. And so you can imagine now, this fight is going to get more and more amplified because the US now goes coast to coast. You have in Congress what is called the Wilmot Proviso, Wilmot, W-I-L-M-O-T, Proviso. And this was a bill that was introduced in Congress. It was a free soil bill to ban slavery in all of the territories acquired from Mexico. This was a non-extension policy. It's defeated. Remember, the South has all of those extra, all of those extra congressmen because of the 3/5 clause. They're able to defeat the Wilmot Proviso. And again, it looks like a North-South conflict. But David Wilmot argued explicitly that it was a white man's proviso. He said that the territories were for free white labor. And he supported, like many others, Democratic free soilers, free states would ban the entry of Black people. So Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Oregon, these are anti-slavery states. But one of the key takeaways of this presentation is that anti-slavery and anti-Black could and did historically go together. They were linked. You don't want the extension of slavery. That is what anti-slavery meant in the politics of the time, because you had a vision of a white nation and you saw the territories as for white labor, for their safety valve. Now, what happened on the heels, and my time is rapidly going, you have the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. The reason this is important is because now we have a new figure on the scene. His name is Stephen Douglas. He's a Northern Democrat, and he's associated with what's called the popular sovereignty doctrine. And this was the doctrine that said, well, we don't want the federal government to do anything in the Western territories. We want local majorities to decide the question for themselves. We want popular sovereignty. We want local majorities to say slavery up or down. And so he's associated with this popular sovereignty position. Stephen Douglas wanted, I mean, this is sort of probably too much in the weeds. He wanted to get a railroad built through the northern part of the United States. And he made a deal with the Southern Democrats, the pro-slavery folk. And the deal was that they were going to revoke the Missouri Compromise. Now remember, the Missouri Compromise said no slavery north of 3630. And what the Kansas-Nebraska Act did is that it opened that territory to slavery. So popular sovereignty here is really a kind of a pro-slavery impact doctrine, because land where you couldn't have slavery now is open to slavery. And what happens is what's called Bloody Kansas. You have all of these pro-slavery folk marauding into Kansas to try to establish a pro-slavery government, a pro-slavery constitution. And this is a prelude to the Civil War, because you have literal fighting over Kansas. And what comes out of the Kansas-Nebraska Act is the birth of the Republican Party. So the Republican Party is born in 1854 in direct response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And the principle that organized the Republican Party was the non-extension of slavery, free soil. And that non-extension principle, they had tried it earlier. There's something called the Liberty Party and the Free Soil Party. Those never got traction. The Republican Party gets traction because of what the Kansas-Nebraska Act did. This is the 1850s. This is getting more and more and more intense, this fight. And then it's followed up by the Dred Scott case of 1857. And people are familiar with the Dred Scott case because of the ruling where the Supreme Court said that Blacks can't be citizens of the United States, that a Black person, even a free Black person, had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. Now, the other part of the Dred Scott ruling said that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. So think about this. The Dred Scott case is coming in after that Kansas-Nebraska Act. And the Dred Scott case is saying, you Republican Party, you can't have your principle of non-extension. Unconstitutional. You must let slavery into the Western territories. And so that Dred Scott case was an attack not just on Black people, it was an attack on the Republican Party. And so to kind of distinguish at this point, kind of in a more fine-grained way, these distinctions within the anti-slavery coalition, and it's important to think about it as a coalition. Let me now do that. So on the one side, you've got folks like Frederick Douglass, you've got radical Republicans like Charles Sumner, you've got William Yates, there are many Black abolitionists who were active. Henry Highland Garnett, you've got Robert Morris, Francis Harper, there are many Black abolitionists. And what's distinct about their speeches and their documents, and Frederick Douglass was prolific. And what they did that was distinct was to talk about the impact of slavery on Black people. And in his, one of the things documents I put in the resources was Frederick Douglass's "What to the Slave is the 4th of July" speech. And that speech is interesting in so many ways. And he starts out by praising the Declaration of Independence. He praises the founding fathers for not shrinking from agitating against oppression. So he's clear about what he's praising those founding fathers for not submitting to bondage. But it's Douglass and it's Black abolitionists who bring the charge of hypocrisy. And you have Douglass saying that, I'm going to see this day, this 4th of July, which he says is your holiday. He talks about your holiday, your nation. But he says to him, to the person who's enslaved, your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license. And he talks about these dark and threatening clouds, these degenerate times. And so Black abolitionists are the conscience of the free soil movement at this point, because you've got other free soilers like the David Wilmots, who are very explicitly, and there are many, many, many more of the David Wilmots than there are of the Frederick Douglasses. And so the distinction between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas is just what I want to highlight right now. So I'm sure people are familiar with the Lincoln-Douglas debates. This is in 1858. It's right on the heels of Dred Scott. Give the giveaway right now. Lincoln loses the Senate race. He gains the presidency in 1860, but he loses this Senate race. And the things that I want to distinguish between Lincoln and Douglas, Lincoln says explicitly that the Declaration of Independence includes Black people. And this is movement on his part. And Lincoln is unique in many ways because he evolves. At one point, he's supporting colonization. He gets to the point where he's willing to support Black suffrage for Black soldiers, at which point he's assassinated. So Lincoln moves. But in these Lincoln-Douglas debates, he says explicitly that the Declaration of Independence includes Black people. And Stephen Douglas, responds by calling this a monstrous heresy. And Douglas, Northern Democrat, says that the Declaration of Independence only included white people. He says, and this is Stephen Douglas, this government was made by our fathers on a white basis. It was made by white men for the benefit of white men and their posterity forever, and it was intended to be administered by white men for all time to come. This is the popular sovereignty position. It's a white popular sovereignty position that was deeply racialized. And this, again, is going to matter once we get to Reconstruction in lots of ways. Now, Douglas sort of says, well, it doesn't follow that he should be a slave. And that's where he gives the I don't care position. I don't care if it's voted up or down. And Lincoln castigates him for this. And he says that slavery is wrong and you shouldn't have a don't care position. And he says that those who say that the Declaration excludes Blacks are, quote, blowing out the moral lights around us. And so he's introducing a language of morality that is wedded to an economic vision around free labor and the United States. And so it's important to see that it's neither all economics nor all morality, that these things are combined in the way that Lincoln is attacking slavery. Now, that what the bits that I just quoted came from the debates at Galesburg, and you have those excerpts. And you also have another excerpt of Lincoln at Ottawa, Illinois. This is another one of those debates. And the reason this one I've included is because Douglas here is race baiting Lincoln, and Douglas race baited Lincoln all the time. And he said that Lincoln was in favor of race mixing and what was called social equality, which meant race mixing. The scare tactic was always that if you say Black people are included in the Declaration of Independence, automatically that means you favor white-Black intermarriage. And Democrats did this all the time. Lincoln's response to this is very important and it's crucial for me to identify this, because again, I'm going to pick this up next time. Lincoln said that those race mixing charges were counterfeit, that Douglas says Stephen Douglas's logic was counterfeit. And it's this combination position of Lincoln's that I want to highlight. This is Lincoln. He says, just because I do not want a Black woman for a slave does not mean I want her for a wife. He says, in some respects, she's certainly not my equal. And he says some version of this in a lot of these speeches. In some respects, he says, Black people are not my equal, but in their natural right to eat the bread they earn with their own hands without asking leave of anyone else, they are my equal and the equal of all others. And Lincoln says, I don't support the right to vote. Black people shouldn't have they should not have political equality. That's what voting meant at the time. They should not be socially equal, but they should have these equal civil rights. Again, this is a rights typology that was used at the time to debate the meaning of freedom. And Lincoln, in saying, yes, you're included in the Declaration of Independence, meant you had those equal civil rights, property contracts, suing, making contracts with employers, owning what you earn, testifying in court if somebody harms you. And so to ask the question, did Lincoln believe in equality or not, is to ask the wrong question, because it sets up a dichotomy that's not helpful here. That if you think about racism in dichotomous terms, either you are or you aren't, there's nowhere to put Lincoln. And in fact, there's nowhere to put most of what becomes the Republican Party, because there's absolutely a commitment to white supremacy in certain ways and white superiority in many ways. And Lincoln in 1858 is not ready to say, yes, biracial polity. And he's never willing to say, yes, social equality and integrated schools. Never gets that far. But when he says included in the Declaration of Independence and his argument at Ottawa, it's a combined position where he's willing to go so far, but no further. But this is a combined position. To think about racism as a continuum is how I approach it and what makes the most sense, because it's easy to capture the Ku Klux Klan and it's easy to put Frederick Douglass on the other end, but most of the Republicans are going to be somewhere in the middle. I see Scott coming up. I've got 3 minutes, Scott. Awesome. So Lincoln loses this fight. Stephen Douglas wins the Senate. And what happens right after this is that there's a big depression. And the reason this matters is because folks in the North are on their heels. Labor is in big trouble because of this depression. But cotton in the South, they do really, really well. They're not really hurt by the depression. And it's in this context that James Henry Hammond, this is the Mudsill speech that I referenced earlier, this 1858 speech, this is his Cotton is King speech. And what he says is that the whole world will come to us. Would any nation make war on cotton? Cotton is king, and they have this idea that cotton is somehow going to rule, going to expand, and he's insulting towards the North. He's like, you fetch and carry for us. And it's in this context that the South thinks that cotton is going to really rule forever. And then what happens is that, Lincoln, he has his Cooper Union speech in 1860, which is what gets him the nomination. He wins. And if you look at that electoral map in 1860, once again, it looks like a sectional dispute. Lincoln wins in the North, Breckinridge wins in the South. And as soon as Lincoln wins, the South, they're all full of sensing that they've got cotton as king. They can secede, and they know that they've now lost the Senate. They've lost the West. They secede. South Carolina fires on Fort Sumter. South Carolina fires on a federal fort. And they say, and you see this in all of their documents, that they are seceding for slavery. And you see this in the Mississippi Declaration of Secession. You have that. You see this in the Cornerstone speech by the Vice President of the Confederacy. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery. Slavery is why we're leaving. It's only after they lose the war that they say they were fighting for states' rights. And it's this Herrenvolk theory. The Herrenvolk theory is written into the Cornerstone speech, and you can see it. And so that Union coalition that forms to fight the Civil War, and I'll close on this point, that Union coalition, first got together under the non-extension rule. That's where things were, just no extension, but for very, very different and sharply opposed racial visions of the United States as a nation. And so they came together to fight as the Union, but you've got very huge range among Republicans, from radical Republicans to very conservative Republicans who really didn't even want disunion in the first place. You have your free soil Democrats. You have your Union Democrats, the Stephen Douglas faction. They broke with the South when the South demanded slave law in the territories. Remember, they're popular sovereignty. They broke with the South. And so Stephen Douglas's faction, they're war Democrats. They go with the Union, and they're going to become a very, very powerful opposition during Reconstruction. And then you have that tiny group of evangelical abolitionists. And so I will stop there with the point that the different arguments about what was wrong with slavery and about why you wanted to stop it are going to come out in droves. Those are going to be the lines of conflict during Reconstruction and over those Reconstruction amendments. All right. See you all next time.
Thanks, Dr. Brandwein, for sharing the unique content. This was incredible. So helpful and needed for teaching comprehensive history within our classrooms. So we cannot thank you enough for launching this first webinar for all of us. This specific webinar series continues on January 18th and 25th from 4 to 5 p.m. Please note that each webinar will present new content. So we encourage you to, and educators and everyone attending to, if you haven't registered for the next two and others, to please re-register or register again, or for future, I should say, register for future events. The link is in the chat space. Also, thanks for your patience on some of the links connecting to resources. We will likely be following up with an email to put this resource document there if you were unable to access it. So please keep an eye out for that down the road. We thank everyone for joining us today. Please make sure to complete the survey there at the end that will come to you via email at the close of the Zoom meeting. We really appreciate your time. Thank you, Dr. Brandwein, for everything you've done to start us out in this series, and have a great rest of your day, everyone.